So I thought about using the subtitle of a case study and winging it because I completely rethought what I thought I was going to talk about based on our conversations last night. So my thanks to David and those of you who participated in that conversation, but as a result I didn't get much sleep. So this is white background, black text. It's completely stripped down, both because it was my excuse to do this at 4:30 in the morning, but also I think it also plays against the theme that I'm going to see if we can go against. This is the idea of doing less with less. Somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I think many of you know that public higher ed institutions particularly have been hit really hard by the Great Recession. Right? And in our case, in North Carolina, we had a series of budget cuts that were year over year over year. We had 4 years of the budget of the financial recession. We had 3 years that we had budget cuts 3 years in a row. And this was the first year that we did not have one, which we were kind of sort of celebrating until the new legislative budget officer came in and told us that next year we're getting another one. So yeah, just let that sink in. I've left all the numbers off, and then we'll talk through some of these pieces. So I will say this at the front end. This may sound a little negative to start with. It won't end that way, hopefully. So just just bear with me, and we'll see how far this goes. As she said during the introduction, we are the University of North Carolina system. For those of you who may not know the state of North Carolina, there are 17 campuses in the system. We stretch as far west as Western Carolina, which is up in the mountains. This is the mountain ranges there. We've got Elizabeth City up in the coast, East Carolina, and UNC Wilmington. You'll notice that UNC Charlotte right here is kind of off by ourselves. Right? Again, if you don't know the state, you may not know the background on this. This is actually, Charlotte is also the largest metropolitan area in the state. Right? So we are the single biggest city. The flagship institutions that everyone knows, Chapel Hill and State, are part of the cluster around the second largest regions. Right? So we're in this really interesting geographic position in that we have the entire largest city of the state to ourselves. Right? So that's got some really interesting implications, and hopefully will open us up to do some interesting things. A little bit about the history of UNC Charlotte. We are about 60 years old, and as of this academic year, we have 26,000 plus students. So we've grown really fast in a really short period of time, and that has some very interesting implications for us, and especially around IT. I came to UNC Charlotte in 2006, and one thing I immediately noticed is that we didn't really have a very well integrated approach to how we deliver IT services. Because we grew so fast, we made a series of decisions that effectively have put resources for IT in distributed areas. There are 7 colleges that make up the university. Each of the colleges has their own IT unit, right? Varying sizes. And I should tell you a bit about my history. I first came to UNC Charlotte to lead one of those distributed units. So I don't mean to say that disparagingly. It's just a statement of fact. Right? Those groups have grown. My favorite joke is that one of the colleges, they only have 2 or 3 staff people. Another college is so large, they actually have their own vehicles. So it really does run the gambit. Right? This is the growth of UNC Charlotte since 2000. All right. So for the sake of this presentation, the part I had prepared ahead of time, I was using a language, instead of just focusing on the growth of our student population, which we often do, I realized that for IT, it's not just students. It's also the faculty staff as well, right? So if I count for everybody, it's a 52 or 53% growth in 12 years. That's it, please. Yeah, we don't, I'll answer the first question first. Has the facilities grown like this? No. No. We do have more buildings than we did initially, especially because I thought about showing you a campus map. UNC Charlotte is on 1,000 contiguous acres, and we own a lot of area around us as well. When it was created 60 years ago, it was farmland, and I'm not exaggerating, farmland. So we're about 9 miles outside of the city center. So it was I've met alums who told us when they went to school there, their friends kept saying, "Why are you going to school out in the country?" Because that 9 miles felt really different. So we have a lot of physical space to grow, but no, the buildings haven't grown like that. They have grown, but not like that. And that's a very great observation around the size of the faculty, the staff. The size of the faculty actually hasn't kept up either. But that continues to be one of our great challenges. One quick point of note, I was part of the Fry class this past summer, which is how I met Joanne. And at that time, we had just, in fact, I think that Monday when we began, I got a note from our admissions office that we had been trying to slow down our growth right around the start of the recession. We knew we weren't going to get additional funding. So the first thing you want to do is slow down your growth. Which I think we all know this, that it's a yield thing, right? You want to put out as many acceptances as you can, and you try to balance. It's a balancing act, and we were doing fairly well until last summer. That was not intentional. We were trying to grow by 50 students total. We grew by 1,000. Right? That was a mind-blowing jump in that 1 year. Right? So I just want you to have this as background, but I want to focus on the last 5 years, right? Because a 12, 13-year window is useful for planning purposes, but I think we all know for IT, the change just accelerates far faster than that. So let's just look at the last 5 years. In that span, the campus community grew by 11.99% if you want to be specific, but we'll say 12%, all right? 12% growth. And I wanted to show you a couple of interesting points that I think just show that we may not be able to keep up with the delivery of IT services in the way that we did in the past. Right? So this is the growth of calls to our service desk. We'll just start with some of the simple things. That grew by 135%. Notice one of the pieces I thought was interesting, it wasn't from the students. Right? That they're not actually calling us more. Now, it's not that, a lot of people argue, well, the students are much more self-sufficient. I think that's part of it. That they are much more technically savvy. I think that's part of it. We have the highest percentage of Pell qualified students in our student body than any other institution in our system. Right? So I think it's upwards of 60 or 70%. It's a really high number. Right? We also have the highest percentage of first generation students in our system. Right? So I don't think it's just that they're tech savvy. Many of our students actually don't have their own technologies. Or when I sit down and ask them what kind of phone, you ask one of my favorite questions, how many devices do you have on you right now that can use wireless? Some of our students will whip out 2 or 3 or 4, 5 was my highest number so far, that they actually had on them at the time. But then I also have other students who ask, can I see your cell phone? And they've got a phone, a flip phone, and not one of the nice new flip phones with a keyboard. I mean, it's a flip phone. So we've got to deal with all of that. All right. Tickets to the service desk. This actually, I find the contrast between these two rather mind-blowing because we've been trying to get our service desk staff to really record everything, and they're clearly not. 6,000 less actual tickets getting recorded than actual calls coming in, but that's another point. But again, that's still going up, right? 78% still going up. All right, one of my favorite figures. Notice the scale is different because I don't have access to the data before spring 2011. This is in a span of 2 years. It jumped from 2,000 to 8,000 simultaneous connections on a wireless network. That's not for the day, that's at one time. Right. So what that does to our network bandwidth has been pretty interesting to watch. This is 1 hour aggregate bandwidth measured in megs per second. So blue is maximum, and what we actually get charged for is in the red, the 95th percentile. Okay. And you'll notice that the maximum grew by 183%. The 95th percentile grew by 170. Now, this actually is interesting because when I showed this in a budget presentation a few weeks ago, some of our university administrators started asking, well, should we be trying to control that? Should we? All right, see that smile. Thank you very much. I was appalled at the question, actually. Should we be trying to meter that and charging people for it? Now, here's the part that's interesting. One of the great advantages that the state of North Carolina has is that 25 years ago, when we had a completely different mindset to how we funded higher education. This is being recorded. I'll stop there. The state invested in a system called North Carolina Research and Education Network, NCREN. Some of you may have heard of it. NCREN, effectively, to start with, created a network ring connecting all of the higher education institutions. The ring has now expanded. It means it's got a lot more services. But effectively, the differential for us to go from what we paid last year, what we'll pay this year, is about $20,000. Right? We actually can absorb that entire. If we ran even at that height for the next year, we would pay $66,000 for the year. for our network connection. Right? So it's actually really, really cheap. The expensive part, though, is that can your network actually handle that kind of throughput? Right? So our provider will give it to us really cheap. But the differential for us to get the capacity, our limit, I should have told you this at the beginning, we actually had a 1 gig limit, a hard 1 gig limit up until last year. Right? So we got really nervous, and this is 2013, we got really nervous when we started seeing that. Right? So my predecessor, our former CIO, worked with the chancellor because one of our many issues is that we actually don't fund the network. No one pays for the network. They pay for phones. We can't be the only ones. You're looking at me like this is a foreign language. Now, maybe your institution solved this long ago than before we did. But in public higher ed, it's been a pretty recent thing to start rethinking how do you actually fund the network. People are used to paying for phone charges. So that's where our only source of revenue comes from, other than budget allocation. But the network isn't charged for it, though the phones are voice over IP, so let that sink in. We charge you for the phone, but not for the network it runs on. So, yeah. I wish it was that clear, but no, it's not. In fact, students are interesting for us. The residence halls don't count in this at all. As of, I think 2010 it might be in there, but 2009 it was, I think, around the time they changed it. The residence halls are actually completely privately handled network-wise by Time Warner. So this just reflects faculty and staff and student activity in the library or anywhere else, anywhere on campus, right, but not in the dorms. So yes, effectively all this is being funded, but not funded by the campus as a whole. And I think that's one of the points I was trying to make. Is that making sense? Oh, God, no. Oh, sorry. No, it's not. I use them personally, right? There's a lot of things they do really, really well. You can't run like that. You know, at least not in our area. They can't provide services like that. Yeah, NC Run runs circles around the stuff that anyone else could do for us. So, which I'm trying to hope. I hope that our state legislature remembers, because they don't apparently recently. I'm really going to get in trouble. Sorry, please. Yes, we expanded to 10. The chancellor spent just under $1 million last year to help us expand the core access. And actually, that's not the core on campus. That's just the core throughput to get from campus to our provider so that we actually can scale higher. Now, the challenge for us is to actually take advantage of that. You've got to work backwards and expand it to the buildings that you actually need higher. And that's a completely different, messier, and much more expensive conversation that we've begun. But it means that we're going to be doing some things piecemeal. I highly doubt we're going to miraculously discover we've got millions to invest to redo some of these older buildings. So I think what we're going to do is work with the campus to tell us which buildings. You know, we've got our engineering places. We have a new portal building, which is a public-private partnership that we are doing with other private industries around to come into a building on campus. We may do it there first, things like that. But yes, the big challenge was, you know, my predecessor Jay had to go back to the chancellor and convince him to find $1 million to put into it. That's not really sustainable. All right, so I call this section what less looks like. I may skip this slide because this is actually a NACUBO, the National Association of College University Business Officers, for those who may not know them. This is a graphic that they had generated to try to represent the gap, the funding gap, between the cost of public higher education and actually the state appropriations for it. But there's a limit for the sake of this conversation. This actually stops in 2008. And that's about the time the recession hit. Right? And also around the time that we had some differences in, or some changes in the perception that higher education is actually a public good versus a private good. Right? So I'm going to avoid that political conversation altogether and just kind of blow through this slide. But I did want to show you what less looks like for the central IT group. Right? This is actually the ITS other than personnel budget for the last 5 years. And on the face of it, it doesn't look that bad. Right? Until I start showing you some of the other pieces. This is again from that same budget presentation I did back in November. We get two primary sources of funds. The blue are actually state allocations, so the pieces you would expect. The red are student fees. And what's been happening for the last 5 years is our share of the state allocation has gone down and our dependence on student fees has gone up. Right? In some ways that makes sense, but it creates some really interesting differences. And this is a bit messy, so let me talk you through it. The green is actually our beginning budget for the central IT group for the last 5 years. The red is how much we actually spent. And the green is the orange, which is really hard to tell on the screen. I apologize for that. The orange is how much we actually were responsible for spending, because in our world, there are times I'm given money that adds to our budget to do something, and there are times I say I need to do something and someone else buys it. But it's still, it's spent on our behalf, essentially. And if I account for all of that, you'll see there's a dramatic gap between the actual needs. I did this presentation for the group that's sort of responsible for this, and there was quite some eye-opening. We'll see if it actually changes something, but this has been going on for a long time. All right, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about what less looks like when it goes bad, and then hopefully switch to the more positive. I did say it's going to be a bit of a downer to start with, right? So I did warn you when we got in. What less looks like when it goes bad. I'll give you 2 simple examples and then one that's actually pretty significant for us. The first is that we have our classroom support folks are funded. Someone will say, I want to convert a classroom to put new technologies in, smart technologies and so forth. Real wonderful job. The challenge is their model is built on doing it as cheaply as you possibly can. And in their case, it has meant in some cases that they have drilled into the network jacks to get a connection, to run the cable up to where the projector and the other places in the room they need it, because they don't have the resources, they feel, to pay the networking folks to do it correctly. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean really drilling into the network faceplate. Right? So that's the simple one. The other is that the unfunded network needs, the pieces I talked about already, because we are trying to do less with less, and we're taking shortcuts in places that we shouldn't. The ones that unfortunately became much more public, and I'm hoping it didn't quite get the attention of all of you, is that in 2012, we had 2 security incidents. The first one, two members of our ITS teams misconfigured the central file system. And they misconfigured it in such a way that it actually exposed it to the web, that if you had the correct URL, you could drill right into any of these specific folders, including mine. So you could get to any of my H drive folders with my personnel records and all the stuff I had in it. Now, it was that way for about 3 months. And the reason it got really bad is that Google crawlers found it. So we had a faculty member in the library who Googled his name, and something popped up that wasn't supposed to be there. And at first they thought someone had taken it, until we realized you could, in my case, you could Google my name, and anything that I happened to know was in the folder, and the results would come back up. All of that actually works as long as your folks don't misconfigure the system, right? So we locked it, right? We locked it, closed it up. Sorry. So we fixed that. We closed it up, and then we had to do an investigation to figure it out. That's actually where the story gets really interesting. In the course of the investigation, we discovered that one of the distributed units, because they felt that they could provide a better service than Central could, had their own file system. Anyone familiar with AFS, the Andrew file system? They had an AFS file system. They'd been running it for the better part of 15 years or more. Right? And AFS is built to be open, and it was. And in the process of investigating it, we actually discovered a single file. There were others, but we found a single file that had 250,000 addresses and social security numbers in it. For every UNC Charlotte faculty, staff, and alum who had ever been at the institution at that point. And it had been sitting in that folder for 15 years. Right? So when I say what it looks like when less goes bad, it can go really, really, really bad. That was most of 2012 for us. Right? So that's the last of the downers, I hope. But here are some things where I think it can go well. And this is what I actually came prepared to talk about, was that idea of what is extending the idea of enterprise IT. For us, I think it's become a question of, well, what is actually the enterprise? And that's what I took away from the conversation last night. That last graphic that David had of showing those layers, right? That our job is to protect to have the data and the metadata and add the services on top of it, and then decide on what are the apps we actually will build and then do the best job we can on inviting others in to build the apps for us. But the challenge that we've had in our environment is that we've been trying to do that entire stack ourselves because historically that's been our job. And I've begun questioning now, I'm not so sure that's our job. And whether the institution is explicitly telling us that or not, the funding sure is. And I think that's the place we are now. So I wanted to just blow through a couple of examples and see if there's some questions or conversation around it. One of my favorites is student computing. On the first slide, I apologize, I didn't tell you the background. I am the interim CIO. My home role is the Director of Client Services. I led one of the distributed units for 5.5 years, and then the Health Informatics unit, and then I came into the Central IT unit in 2011 as a Director of Client Services. I was there for just under a year before my predecessor went off to greener pastures, which I'm fond of teasing him. He's now at the land of plenty. He's over at Princeton. And my job in client services involved being responsible for the student computing function. We didn't actually have a full team around it, but for the functions. Let me tell you a bit about our environment. Across campus, we have more than 2,000 workstations dedicated for student computing. We've taken up more than 70 spaces in a bunch of different places. 60,000 square feet are dedicated to it right now. This was not intentional, right? No one said, I want to dedicate this kind of space and footprint to it, but because things have been distributed for so long, they just kind of developed over time. And what most people focus on is the actual hardware replacement, about $2.5 million that we have invested in it. We had about a $500,000 a year that we were doing in a replacement cycle. Right? That's the only reason I knew the numbers. But when we started going back and looking at, well, how many staff are actually, some portion of their job is related to supporting this, it's a much higher number, 60+ staff members. Right? And depending on the percentage of their job, we're spending $3 to $5 million a year on supporting them. But then watch what's been happening. This is actually, there are two, of all the spaces, there are two that are dedicated completely to just public use. There are no classes, there are no exams in there. One of them is a 24-hour lab that the ITS group runs, and the other is in the library. So I want to show you just 2 slides of data from there. If you look at the ITS numbers, you'll notice 2 things. Blue is the number of logins for the year, and red is the number of unique users. I apologize for the scale. I couldn't find a way to cheat that and make it much more easier to read. But you'll notice that both have declined pretty consistently. The library has, and actually I should point this out, notice that our scale stops, and you'll see the number differences. The library has more than almost 3 times as many visitors as we do, but even with the much higher volume, they're still declining as well. Except in one interesting place that we're still trying to figure out why that's happening. They're actually seeing more unique users, but they're actually having less total logins. It's a really interesting dynamic to watch happen. But our library is also a really nice place to go. We have a cafe in it. You actually have security. You got all these other pieces that no other lab on campus has. Please. That's correct. That's a very good question. I appreciate you asking it. This is just the physical places. This is just the desktops. So not adding, because it's messier for us to add the other pieces, but I think it would be an important one to see. It would be dramatically higher. Please. Yes. Yes, we have Google Docs, and we actually have, the student email is on Microsoft system. So they actually have the ability to do a lot of it from a lot of different places. They didn't have the ability to do some pieces they needed to, like printing. We just fixed that this semester, actually. So, please.
Would that be because you're doing a stellar job in reliability?
That might be it. That could be part of it. I don't think so, but I'll have to pocket that one away when I get in an argument with them. Please. Yes. The short version is yes. The question was, will this lead us to try to rethink how we support personal devices? Yes. I started something last year, even before my role changed, that we've been calling the Future of Student Computing Initiative, and that's what it's all been about. Rethinking how do we provide support so that they can use their own devices more. Yeah. So in fact, we were doing it before the BYOD acronym was thrown around so much, and that's why I actually don't. It's not my default, but yes. Yes. Same concept. In our environment, one of the things we needed to do was make sure they actually could get hardware support for their devices. They couldn't get that before. And that meant they had to go to Best Buy or Office Max and kind of fend for themselves. So we made a partnership with one of the private groups on campus to actually provide that for them through us. So they just come to us, if it's software, we do it. If it's hardware, we get it to them. And if it's under warranty, it's paid for. directly from the vendor to the provider. And if it's not, the students get a quote and they can decide what they want to do with it. We did that. We did wireless printing, and we did one other piece that I want to talk about, the hosted VDI, right? Everybody knows, I think, that virtual desktops really present the future of student computing in a lot of ways. But if you have 26,000 students and you have the budgets that we do, you can't do it yourself. Not at scale. You know, not at scale. We actually had a quote about 4 years ago for about $3 million. It never happened because it cost $3 million, right? So what we found last year, we actually found, this one's really interesting, I think. We found a little company called Desktone that had come up with a technology that allowed them to do true multi-tenant cloud-based VDI. Right? Most of the other providers said, we can host it for you, but you're going to have your own dedicated servers. You have to have dedicated hardware. So the scaling issue was still there. It's not like they were going to just scale whatever we needed to and only charge us for what we use. But if you can actually do true multi-tenant, then you can. And we found a company that's called Desktone that actually could do that. But while we were negotiating with them, the part that we were nervous about is if they went belly up mid-semester, then what? Well, Dell struck up a partnership with them. They didn't buy them. They just partnered with them. So that now our contract is with Dell, and Dell is actually, we're in the process, and this semester we'll have it available for testing the very first time. That's one of the ones that we're really excited about. Storage. This one's just a quick one. This one's a simple one. We provide 24 terabytes of file storage now. Again, we can't continue to scale it out. We can buy 500 terabytes from Box. You know, it's a no-brainer if you got the money, right? So that's the big if. But it's $160,000. It's comparatively cheap compared to what we spend for what we're doing on campus. And student advising is the last one I just wanted to talk about. We built something 2 years ago that we call Niner Advisor. It's an advising scheduling system that has been really well received. The challenge that the faculty have had and the advisors have had is how do I get my advisees to get scheduled, to be able to know when I'm available. You know, the ways they were doing it before were paper-based, and they were buying some systems that just did not do what we needed to. So we built our own system, which has been very, very well received, which then also brings with it the catches. How do you keep up with developing it? Because now we have a list, I believe it's of 20 or 30 enhancements to the system, and some of those enhancements are simple, some of them are so not. And what we're starting to ask is, should we be trying to keep up with this? Or do we position this as this was our first iteration at it? We wanted to make sure that we were comfortable with it as an institution, we understood how else this could serve us, and it is disposable. And that becomes part of the question now. How do we position something that we invested so much time in such a way that we are comfortable moving away from it should we need to? Has anyone heard about the Student Success Collaborative? This is with the Education Advisory Board. A couple of nods. Just thought I would show you this. The Education Advisory Board is a think tank out of DC, as they all seem to be, around higher education. And what they're trying to do is how do we measure, how do we get the right metrics around student success, right? Because, again, going back to the funding model for public higher education is shifting to being much more driven on performance metrics. And so they've been showing, they've been working on this data for a long time, working with their partner institutions, that they know that there are some criteria that are really important to successful students, student success, excuse me. And how can we build a system that will allow us to know those metrics for our institution in as close to real time as we possibly can? Again, could we do that in the environment using the system that we'd already built and continue to build on it, putting our banner information in it and then building the right analytics engines around it? We probably could if we had the right amount of money. Instead, what we're doing is we're working with them to actually use, again, their hosted system. And I think they've done something that's actually pretty brilliant as far as marketing is concerned. Instead of just selling the software, what they're selling is membership in a consortium. So there's, I believe we're up to 25 or 30 participating institutions now that are helping them actually refine the system itself so that they can actually build the true analytics into it. So we can tell them, these are the algorithms that we need, these are the questions that we need to be able to ask and answer, and they can build them into the systems itself. And we just began that work with them in January, and we're just getting into it. But I thought these were some pretty interesting examples for us of how that extension of the concept of the enterprise is allowing us to address some needs without necessarily having to solve the issues ourselves. But I'll skip over that one. Yeah, I'll skip over that one for now. Any questions or feedback on that? I think all of those pieces have to be considered. I will say at the front end that we have not completely answered that for ourselves as an institution. I think a lot of our faculty are frankly still a little afraid of the concept of a MOOC. We've done we actually have been really successful in our online education efforts. But there's still a difference between serving a defined number of students. We still have many of the same processes wrapped around our online education that we do on campus. So, shifting that to a model where anyone can come in is something that I think we're still thinking through. Now, where I think our challenge will continue to be is that even if we just look at this as being market-driven, knowing that the students are still choosing to come to residential institutions and are still looking to accomplish those degrees, we still have to solve the issue of how do we make sure they're actually successful while they're here. And I think MOOCs could be part of it. I was really intrigued by that idea that Katie was talking about of institutions partnering to use some of the content, but folding the content into their existing courses. I think those are some places that maybe some low-hanging fruit for us to really start to question that and seeing how we can take advantage of it. Please.
How are the other states within the Carolina compared to your growth? And are there any initiatives that you're working with that?
I'll answer the second part first.
17 jobs.
Yep. There are 17. There are 17 campuses in the system. We actually partner together really well, and I do it very often. In addition, the UNC system office itself, there's a general administration office, which is the office of the system president, and they have a CIO, and they have a shared services alliance, they call it. Among other things, they're actually running banner for 7 of the smaller institutions. So they're looking at how can we provide services so that each of the individual institutions don't necessarily have to do it for themselves. I think some things work really well, some things are going to be really messy to consider, and that partnership is becoming stronger. There has been a CIO council within the system for years. We actually now have a Chief Security Officer Council as well. I know the business officers meet regularly, the provosts meet regularly, so they have these consortia within the system that have been really helpful. But to answer your first question, as far as growth, we still have the highest growth of the system. In some cases, it was by far, but we still have the highest growth. And that was intentional. I should point that out. It didn't just happen. I believe it was 9 or 10 years ago. The system looked at all of the institutions and said, well, we can't sustain growth in some of our flagship institutions the way we did before. We just don't have the space for it anymore. So which other institutions can actually accommodate the actual growth? And they became targets for growth efforts. So they were advertising wrapped around it. They were trying to encourage more students to enroll at those institutions to try to accommodate the needs of the state as a whole. And we were one of those. Yeah? No other questions? Please.
We talked about the extension of the enterprise, but let's talk about the extension of the role of the CIO. I mean, that changed as well. I mean, and how has that changed?
I will say I think it needs to. I think it has in a large part. One of the gifts that I believe Jay Dominic, our former CIO, has that he really brought to our campus is he was an academic. Right? And it was the first time we actually had an IT leader, a CIO, who really could converse around issues of student success, about retention. It was, I think, unusual before him to be an active participant in those conversations, at least at that level. We've been really fortunate that the Center for Teaching and Learning on campus is actually part of ITS. And in my role, it's been really important to protect them, right? Because they are that academic voice inside ITS, and we have to really listen to them. Because we're known for doing things and ignoring the academic calendar, as an example. They don't do that, and so making sure that they have the ability to influence the things that we do. But I think the CIO role needs to be much more expansive if we're going to serve in institutions that have needs like this. It's not enough to be chief order taker. If all I'm doing is just responding to your requests, then I'm not really in a position to see how else we could contribute or how we might be able to even expand beyond what you were initially asking for. So I think that it means that the CIO has to be much more tied to the mission of the institution, right? And it's easy to say it's the academic mission. In our case, it's actually threefold. It's the academics, the research, and community engagement. It's really well defined in our case as an institution. But does the ITS organization actually tie to each of those, and how do we do it?
I love the idea of maybe aligning IT with the mission of the institution. Right? How unambiguous is the mission of the institution?
You know, I will give our chancellor a lot of credit. I'll say this loudly. Give you a lot of credit. I think it was maybe 5 years ago. He started articulating a phrase that UNC Charlotte is North Carolina's urban research institution. And I thought that was a really well-designed vision statement, because it's tough to argue with. Or we are not the flagship, right? So if we said we were the best research institution, whatever, you mean any of those other ways you can think of would pose a challenge that I think a lot of people would come back and counter. But because of the geography I talked about, that we are in the largest urban center in the state. We are North Carolina's urban research institution. And that fundamentally changes a lot of the things about us. But that change, as with probably any change, is difficult. I was involved in recently took part in the search process for the new dean for our School of Education. And the candidates came in and spoke to that mission statement, that vision statement of North Carolina's urban research institution. But then one of the candidates, and actually two different things happened. One candidate spoke directly to it in her presentation, did a really great job. But then faculty raised their hand afterwards and said, well, what if my research area doesn't actually connect to urban education? Yeah, and at first the candidate was a little stumped, I think, because they said, well, the vision statement has said this is what you are, until some faculty raised their hand and said, no, that came from the chancellor. You know, that's that's what we want to be, and that's what we're moving towards. That's not necessarily who we are yet, and that transition is a really messy process. That answer your question? All right. No, thank you all very much for. Oh, please. I'll give you two answers, and the first may seem, in fact, in our case, it's been really difficult to use. We did not have a well-defined IT governance process before. We had advisory groups, which were wonderful for conversation, but they didn't really have any decision rights. And so what would happen is ITS would come into those conversations and say, oh, by the way, we've decided to do these things, and it's already happened. And because there weren't any decision rights, you really couldn't say much. So having a new governance structure means that an idea from anyone, including us, can be brought to the table and we can have a wider campus conversation around it. Unfortunately, in the case of our institution, it's being seen at this point, and we're working on changing that, as just more bureaucracy. So I've had university leadership in some cases just flat out ask, well, can we just go around it? Well, you can, but if you do, then you're short-circuiting the opportunity to have those wider conversations and critique the idea itself, and then hopefully find advocates for it. So it's not just us trying to sell the need. But then the other piece to that is I think that's one of the great needs of leadership. And I don't just mean in the role of the CIO. I mean that each of the directors, each of my direct staff in ITS really needs to have that much broader sense of what their role is. Because if my role is just to make sure the systems are running, I've completely missed it. And if my role is just to make sure things are secured, I've completely missed it. Because I think we all know the most secure device in the world is the one that's not connected to anything. It doesn't do you any good. So we've got to make sure that the leadership itself really has that sense as well. I think those two things are our best opportunity to go after it right now. And I would welcome others if you have other thoughts about that. Please. We do. I think it's a bit of both. I can give you examples of both. Last year and the year before, student government is known for passing legislation, asking for things. So a few years ago, they passed legislation that they wanted Google Apps. Not we want a better email system. We want Google Apps, right? Last year it was we want a mobile app. And they gave very specific, so we want a mobile app, we want these pieces in it. And I think to the credit of the ITS organization at the time, we tried to respond to that, even though we weren't really staffed to do it. We tried to build it ourselves. So we've been trying to build a different dialogue with them so that when they come to us with a request or demand, really, that we can sit down and say, well, this is what you're asking for, but if we do it this way, we may be able to get there faster in a way that's more sustainable. So with the mobile apps request, we're now working on a responsive web. We were talking about that a bit this morning. We've developed and delivered already responsive web solutions, and we're now actually working with them to brand a student-facing aspect of it that they get to decide what's on it. So we're working with student government to make that happen. About a month ago, student government invited me to a meeting where, again, they were considering legislation. Thankfully, they talked to me beforehand, which was nice, that they actually wanted to specifically ask for more checkout laptops. And I said, well, I'm curious, why? And they said, well, we think we need more. So I said, well, how many of you actually own your own laptops? Everybody raised their hand. Okay, how many of you bring it to campus? A third of them put their hands up. I said, well, talk to me about why not. So, well, it's heavy, it's big, and the battery doesn't last very long, and I've got no place to plug in. Most of our classrooms are designed like this. The powers are around the perimeter. If it's a really large classroom, that doesn't really help you if you're in the middle. I mean, so all those pieces. So what I did is I heard them out, and I said, look, I'm scheduled 2 days from now to come talk to student government anyway, to come talk to the Senate. I will present to you what we're doing on the Student Computing Initiative. So I just took 15 minutes, talked them through the different pieces, what's coming with VDI, the fact that we've enhanced wireless, that we're working with Box to get them storage solutions, all those pieces. And at the end of it, I went back to the same senators and said, okay, does that help? And they completely scrapped the legislation they were considering. Because there are times, I think they're limited by what they know, right? And so it's got to be a give and take. There's got to be some dialogue in there. I give really long answers when I'm ready. I'm sorry about that. Please.
Planning on getting pressure on putting up power or research things that are going to we find with planning design and learning space, which definitely needs more power.
Yeah.
Or we need a place for people to plug in and do that.
Yeah.
I think we bring up a very good point. A lot of people don't really understand how open really was in his education, how open we were in work. And last night we talked all about knowledge and the panel and all put together. But it's a matter of communication, full collaboration, getting people to work together, getting a solid cylinder.
Cylinders of excellence. Yeah, I've got to copy that. Yeah. I truly agree. And there were two things we did along those lines in the time that I've been interim. The first, we filled a position that we called the Client Engagement Coordinator. We started with that because the idea was we don't want this person just to be talking to campus. We want them to be participating in student government meetings. We want this to be the face that this is the person from ITS. If you have questions, you're considering legislation, this is the person that you see regularly and you can just go talk to. They're going to faculty council meetings, that they're in all these places on a regular basis. But then we're also filling a communications / kind of marketing position that then actually helps us really get that voice out to campus on a regular basis. But I thought that that order was important, that if all we did was start with marketing, then we're just kind of giving the sales pitch to you. But if we start with engagement, then we're hearing from you and letting that to kind of define what the message itself is. The slide I skipped is an interesting one. It's something we're doing called the IT Master Plan. It's a campus-wide IT strategic review. Because I talked about how quickly we grew and things that were centralized and distributed. We got the initial draft of the first deliverable, which is a current state assessment. And actually, this you might find it interesting, Bruce. Much of it was driven by surveys of IT directors on campus to get a sense of what IT services are they using and what are their experiences like and so forth. We prepared our staff that a lot of this is going to be negative. We know that, right? We've got some issues to work through. But some of the initial data has been mind-blowing. Less than half of the IT staffing on campus is in the central group. Less than half of the IT funding on campus, things that we kind of intuited but never really seen the hard data. But then we got to the actual survey of what services are they using. And we actually had IT directors reporting that they do not use the university network. How's that possible? And it's de-identified, but you know which areas reported it. It's mind-blowing stuff to read through. We had 73% reported using the university network, 75%, something like that, reported using secure login to their computers. How else are you logging in? So there are clearly some perception differences. And what we said to the consulting company we're working with is like, because their suggestion was, well, we know some of these are wrong, so we're just going to drop them off. Don't drop them off. I want to know that the misperceptions are there, so that we know we have to do a better job of helping the campus understand these are resources you use all the time. And if you don't perceive it, then it's really easy for you to go out with a contractor and decide, well, this vendor is going to do X and Y for me, and it's only going to cost us $50,000 a year. Well, that's because it's running on top of the stack that you're not even accounting for because you don't have to, right? And we've got to find a way to change that. And so I think the perceptions have been really, really important for us, but it's made that process, that master plan process, much more convoluted, because it's not enough just to take the feedback. You've also got to make sure those perceptions are validated, and that's a much, much harder process for us. I am talking way too much, but thank you. Thank you, and I do want to say thank you very much for the invitation, Joan. Thank you all of us. Thank you all of you for the conversations. Last night really helped me in a lot of ways. There were some pieces I've been mulling over. I interviewed on Friday, and we begin the process moving forward. And this is really helpful for me to start thinking about how else to frame. It's not just an argument between centralized and distributed. Okay? It's also how do we make sure the services and the needs are actually being addressed. So I appreciate it.